Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Doctors Schuster and Oxley, The Power of Stories. We are joined in this episode by our friend, the CEO of Cancha, Jack Oswald. Jack, welcome. Before we introduce you, let me sort of set up the podcast episode a little bit. There is a tennis theme here that will probably emerge at some stage in the discussion. So as I was reflecting on this particular podcast, I couldn't help but to think of the big stories that I had heard surrounding tennis. I'm a bit of a tennis fan. We have had, Sue and I have had this ambition of traveling around the world to see the major events in each of the big countries, and we're fortunate enough to have done that. But also I like reading the tennis stories. Started to some extent with me reading John McEnroe's autobiography in the 90s, of course, aptly titled, You Cannot Be Serious. But I really took something from that book. He was relentlessly committed to moving forward. He talks about being a servant volleyer, and his ethos on life, his approach on life was just this sort of constant forward motion and momentum. And it was a metaphor that really stayed with me, that you will get knocked back, but keep moving forward. Don't stay still. Now, McEnroe's personality is to some extent a force of nature, and the book goes on to tell all of his exploits. But I like that idea of commitment, momentum, and moving forward. And then, of course, there was Andre Agassi's autobiography, simply called Open. And it was very honest. And actually, in certain points, when he talks about how much he hated tennis, how much he detested it, and his father's discipline in making him practice, and how hitting it in the net was the worst thing ever. But there was also something about the discipline and the passion. In Agassi's case, the autobiography talks about this sort of talent that he had, but it was really difficult to unlock that talent through all of the machine of tennis that was on top of him. He went to the tennis camp in Florida and sort of hated it, and hated the educational side of it. And then he sort of fought to find his space. And when he found his space, he just disciplined. He wasn't really someone who naturally enjoyed the sport, but his discipline, his ability to approach it professionally, in the end saw him vastly successful. And then, of course, Roger Federer. I love watching the 2024 Dartmouth commencement speech. There's something in that. He played 1,526 professional singles matches in his career, and obviously he's legendary for having won 20 plus majors. But the difference between him and his opponents, 4%. He won 54% of the points and his opponents 46. The notion that 4% makes a difference between someone of Roger Federer's standard and everyone else is just mind-blowing to me. So these ideas of tiny, tiny differences making a difference in professional life is something that rings so true. The difference between people that we have worked with mutually, Helmut, who have seen enormous success, and those that have sort of just drifted along. Sometimes it feels like they're vast differences, but the reality is that it's this choice on a Sunday evening to go back to work on a Monday and try harder, do something different, try and improve, are really actually relatively small differences in outlook. And I thought that was a nice setup to some extent to segue into introducing Jack. Before I do so, however, Helmut, anything that you want to comment on with my little lead in there?
Well, I'm just impressed as always. The research, and I think it very much resonated. I was a professional swimmer, so I agree it's discipline. But there's one thing, you mentioned the 4%. And I love that story Federer told as well, but it's a bit like American politics. It's basically 4% of the votes, and it swings either way. And this is actually quite significant. Very, very small things can make a huge difference, as we currently see unfold. So that's my only pearl of wisdom.
Thank you. Well, let me quickly intro Jack. Jack Oswald, thank you for joining us today. CEO and co-founder of Cancha, born in the UK, raised somewhat in the United States, I presume, because of all the tennis work that you did. Former British professional tennis player on the tour, got himself an MBA at some stage. So very much an elite sport discipline, business training, and then now the manufacturer, the designer of premium travel and sports luggage. We've seen some of that start off to some extent in the tennis world and now blur into more general business travel, business luggage. Thank you for joining us, Jack. I hope you're happy to be here.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me, both David and Helmut. I really, really appreciate it.
Jack contributed to our first book, A Career Carol. He was interviewed for that. That's how we first came across him, or at least I did. Now, Helmut, you came across Jack a little earlier in investing in Cancha, but to some extent, was it during COVID that you first met?
Do you actually know the story?
Well, I was
David,
teeing
did
you
I ever
up to
tell you
tell
the
the story.
story? Okay, right. So in COVID, I was looking for a Spanish teacher because I figured my Spanish needs a bit of brushing up. And so I found Jack. And so we had online Spanish lessons. And he was, by the way, a brilliant teacher, you were. But the thing was, I didn't like grammar and all these things, so I always tried to talk about other stuff. And so we started talking about business, and then he talked about Cancha, and then I said, wow, that's really interesting. So I learned about his life, as him as a person. And so I became, I think, a very early investor in your company. My nephew also was quite a successful tennis player, joined me in that. It is a privilege to see you, how the company actually progresses, how the products get better by the month. So that's actually quite excellent. But just for the audience to get to know you a bit better, I always ask a few questions. And to many of the questions, I don't know the answer. Yeah. And the first question I always like to ask about books, because I know you read a lot. I think you're very interested. So what is the book you like best, let's say the previous month? And to make it a bit more difficult, it can't be any of your father's book. Because for the audience, Jack's father is a very, very, very good writer. He must have published now 6, 7, 8 books. And I had the privilege of reading a few, and they're really, really good. So you cannot have a Chris Oswald novel, please. Another book.
Yeah, I think in the last month, I don't actually read I read quite a lot of biographies. I actually really like biographies, more than business books in general, because I think there's a whole lot of interesting stories and different people's paths to where they got to. And so I do read a lot of different biographies. I read one recently called Never Enough by Andrew Wilkinson, who essentially started off as his story in the book starts off as like a barista, basically as a teenager, and he started various different companies throughout his life as the internet was kind of booming in the late 90s, early 2000s, building websites for people, and eventually just riding different waves. He actually one of the things he's noted for is building Slack, the communication app for businesses, but he sold it to another company, and then it grew into this thing, and he's done various different things over time. And it's a really interesting story about his life, about how he businesses that just he had a very successful business life, but actually he kind of realized later on in his career that he had this kind of it was never enough mentality to business, the sense that he kind of let other things fall by the wayside. And there's a really interesting story behind how he comes to realize this and what he does with that money, and all those things as he goes along. So I thought that was a really interesting book, and especially I wouldn't say I could relate on the money side of it, but I can relate in this sort of never enough mentality sometimes that is extremely helpful in business. I think you need that mentality, but I think it can cause you to make wrong decisions in certain areas, especially as you progress throughout. And so I think that was a really, really interesting piece for me.
Okay, excellent. Once you need basically a ghostwriter, once you've sold your company as a unicorn, you're very happy, would be delighted to do the honors. Yeah, so the other question.
Can I just add? I've read some of the stuff that Jack has written on LinkedIn. I think it's really good. He's written a couple of sort of unlocking the door to what it's to be like an entrepreneur and dealing with supply chain issues and lessons that he shares about really kind of authentic and somewhat vulnerable sharing. I really think it's very good. So I would support Helmut in the idea that you should get a book out there. I think that, or books. The trouble is that sometimes these books are about, look at my success. I'm hugely successful. Everything I turn to is, success. I think you learn more from the people who struggle with it, and some things go wrong, and that's life. And I think there's more in.
Do know that there are quite a few people who inspire you, especially the founder of one particular company. But I'm sure there are many other people who currently inspires you as a person, entrepreneur. Who is the person you see as a role model?
Yes, it's in the sporting world. I Roger Federer has definitely been a big inspiration for me. And he's really, I mean, not even in the sporting world, an inspiration for me, because what he's done outside the world of sport has been incredible, especially with his recent collaborations with, or huge involvement with On Running, which has grown to be a massive company. A lot down to his involvement. I think just the way he approached his career in terms of longevity and in terms of really wanting to be a positive actor in the space and not entirely for personal gain, I think is really commendable. I think I always found not just his game style and the way he played amazing, but also his demeanor on and off the court in the various things he's got involved with. So I think he's always been a massive inspiration for me on the sporting side of things. I think in business, there's a few different things. I think obviously, like you said, I couldn't mention my dad's books, but he's certainly been an inspiration for me on the business side. Moved our family to the US when I was born in the US. In fact, a slight correction at the beginning. I was born in the US and my parents are British, but he moved our family out there when basically before I was born, and took on a business. We bought a business for $1, took on all the debt and grew it over the course of 15, 16 years. I didn't notice it when I was younger, but as an adult now, I go back and I can relive all the trials and tribulations he went through memories and understand now what that feels like. Yeah, I think he's been a huge inspiration to me, still is to this day. I think in terms of, just one more thing, in terms of like public companies, I think nowadays is slightly more difficult than it used to be in terms of sort of public CEOs and things. I think because of the fact that I think they're very involved in things outside their domain in terms of politics and things like that, which I don't particularly. It doesn't agree with me particularly. But I think Tobias Lutke, who's the founder of Shopify, who started the company basically starting his own snowboard brand and realized that the software he built behind it was actually more important than the brand he built, has just done incredibly well with that. And I love the way he approaches with his team and the fact that he doesn't have huge tiers of management in Shopify. If you're a developer but you do really well, you'll get paid at the salary of a high level manager, because he believes that's more important, that you keep doing what you're good at than take on a management role that maybe you wouldn't want to do, but you've just done because the corporate structure forces you in that direction. So I think there's some really interesting things that he's doing with that company there. So I think there's various different people that kind of inspire me, but those are some of them.
Okay. Now, I think before we go to your story, a final question, yeah, and this is really to do with you and your company, your products. And the question really is, what is your favorite Cancha product? Now, before I hand over to you, I'm going to answer the question because I love a product which is not a typical product, but I have it on me every single day. And this is this little byproduct. I think it's a wallet. And this is the logo, Cancha, so that everyone can see it. It's brilliant. So, okay, over to you.
No, I really appreciate that. Yeah, that was made from just really just some byproducts of kind of some of the bags we were making and trying to use excess material in the best way we could. And it has been very popular. I think in terms of our bags, I think the bag we started with, which is called the Racket Bag Voyager, which was basically based on me trying to travel more easily as a tennis player, I think is where Cancha originated from. And we've done many different bags outside of tennis and within tennis since then, but that's continued to be very popular. And that's kind of where Cancha really hit some product market fit, I think. And it was based on my own experiences. So I think that definitely holds a special place for me.
I mean, I just recently bought a new product and I've seen the products over the years and I really love the
backpack, all court backpack.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Anyhow,
thank you.
Over to your story now.
We'll hand it over to Jack. Jack, you've got a story to share with us. Go ahead, and then we'll discuss it.
Yeah. So I think my story is a sort of as my transition in my career, I suppose to speak, is kind of what I was thinking that would be quite important to talk about. I think, or at least what I've certainly learned across the way. And I definitely started really as a tennis player, passionate tennis player. From the age of probably 10 years old is when I kind of knew already that I wanted to try and play professionally and make it a career of mine. And picked up the bug while I was living in the US, and really was just in total commitment to that goal from a young age, which is quite strange, I think. And I don't know why. I think it's just from the passion itself, because I think most kids that age can't really, it's difficult to set aside other things that are happening in your life at that time, and just go for something. And I went through, even at that age, a lot of different ups and downs, trying to make it even on just as in junior tournaments. And I left home at the age of 13, uh, and spent time in Europe, living in France and Spain, and then the UK, back again, just trying to make it as a professional tennis player, basically, and trying to build my skills, and living on my own, traveling on my own a lot of the time. And so I think I learned a huge amount from that experience, but it was definitely, tennis is a difficult sport, as people know, in terms of to make a living. And even the top of the top, can make a very good living, but everyone outside that, is the difference is very, very, it's very, very big. And so, um, as it got more and more certain that I wasn't going to be able to make a career, a lasting career out of tennis. I was I had it always in the back of my mind. I was very concerned about what I'd be doing after that, and I assumed that I'd end up going into teaching tennis as a coach or being involved in the sport somehow, because I didn't think confidently I had the skills to move outside of that, out of that domain. And I think in some ways I was very, very lucky to come to really just, I suppose, I took the initiative to start building Cancha, and it was more, out of my own frustrations as a tennis player while I was still playing. And so I think I was lucky to stumble across it. But through naivety and things like that, I sort of started to believe that I could make something out of this business. And I didn't have any business experience apart from having seen my dad run a business, and I didn't really have any experience. And I think that was, in some ways, the naivety helped me along, but I also didn't think that it would ever amount to anything really in the same way. I think because of the fact that I didn't have the career experience out of business. At university, I'd originally studied French and Spanish. I just didn't have that background. And so as I started doing it, I just tried to approach it the same way I did with tennis, in the sense that I just focused on getting better and better by the day, whether it was, all areas of business, whether it was, the supply chain side of things, whether it's product design, whether it's, finance. I just tried to get better and better as I went along. And in education as well, in terms of doing the MBA, that was a big part of just trying to get myself up to speed. And then, that was almost 5 years ago. So I've been doing Cancha for the last 5 years, and I've learned made a huge amount of mistakes over time. But I think it's interesting. I think the main thing is that through tennis, I was able to use that perseverance to get somewhere in another career sector, regardless of my starting position. I think my starting position was perhaps behind a lot of people my age and who maybe go into that sort of thing. And I was able to recoup a lot of that through perseverance and through just a mindset that I applied from tennis into business. So I think I was very lucky that tennis taught me that. But I think the biggest thing that I learned from that is using those transferable skills is extremely important when switching careers, or when pivoting in life in general. Is that it doesn't mean that one thing is a failure and then you suddenly start from 0% again and have to sort of build up. You have to use that momentum and those transferable skills to your best advantage when going into any other domain, regardless of how related or unrelated it is. And I think that's helped me a lot, especially even on the side of things where it's been completely different. Because there are some similarities with business, but I almost think that people try to make too many similarities between sport and business. And I think that, in fact, while there is, especially with tennis, it's a solo sport, you're on your own out there. And in business, in some ways, it's like that, especially at the beginning when you haven't got a team around you and doing it all on your own. But I do think that there are a lot of different things in business as well, in the sense that even more things out of your control. With tennis, there's some variables in terms of, the weather, the courts, your opponents and things like that. But, I think if we just look at the last, 2025 in terms of everything that geopolitically is happening around the world that affects businesses and startup businesses especially. I think there's a huge amount of things that you have to deal with, learn and adapt to in business. Yeah, I think it's been certainly a difficult journey, I think, over time. But I think without that kind of ability to transfer those skills over to Cancha, I don't know if I would have got through a lot of those things. I think is the main thing from this.
Just a few questions come to mind. And the one thing is, there is in Silicon Valley in America, how important it is to fail and end. When I talk to you, when I see you operating, I see a person who doesn't really have failure in your vocabulary. I think you have probably had a few things that didn't work out the way you wanted in your business, but they never had the impression, that it was ever an option for you. not to make Cancha a success. And I deeply admire that because I realized you had ups and downs and it was not a plain sailing, but your marketing became better. Every month your products are just like off the charts good now, and they really are. So can you talk about the importance of failing um, for success?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think failure, obviously, in terms of miniature failures, are really really important, and big failures as well. I mean, there's a reason why people like to invest in founders that are starting a second company versus their first, is because they get a lot of those things out of the way. But I think failure is is really important. It's the way. It's more of the sort of the mindset towards it. I think I'm not necessarily I don't believe necessarily in this kind of failure for failure's sake, but I do believe in having the right mindset towards setbacks and being able to acknowledge when you make mistakes. I think it's really, really important and being able to learn very quickly from them. I think what can happen sometimes when you're overly confident in what you're doing is that you won't admit mistakes when they're there. And I think that I've done that as well. So I've made that mistake as well. But I think that over time, I think being more humble is helpful because it helps you understand mistakes and not take not take your own viewpoint for granted. And I think that's been really helpful. But it is more about what you do with them. I definitely believe that's the case. And there's plenty of things that happen to any business over the course of I mean their lifetime that can really just drown you, and the only thing that really separates them from drowning you in that moment and not is actually just how you respond to it. It doesn't mean that it's guaranteed to work every time, and there are things that do end businesses, and you never know when that's going to happen to you or if it's going to happen to you. But it is having that mindset towards constantly reflecting and learning from those mistakes, I think.
Going back, Jack, to the time that you were moving from professional tennis to becoming a full-time entrepreneur, maybe share a little bit more about your thinking as you went through that. The interest I have in the story a little bit is I think we all have self-doubts. There's this sense of, we hear a lot about imposter syndrome. Lots of people talk about how they don't feel worthy or they're worried about whether they have the right skills to succeed, and they look around them and they see other people that they think are vastly more talented, and therefore they start to have an inferiority complex. How did you find it? I mean, did you have moments of massive doubt in that process, and how did you overcome them?
Yes, it is really it's quite difficult, I think. When I first really stopped playing, I knew that would be that, at least for playing professionally, I probably spent a year where I was really borderline kind of depressed because I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. I mean, I had Cancha, but Cancha hadn't become something I could depend on in terms of knowing that that would be my next thing. And so because of that, I was really struggling to know what to do. I hadn't, it was more of coming to terms with the fact that that really was, the end of that career for me. So I think like I said, I was very, very lucky to have transitioned to the Cancha because it helped me massively in terms of dealing with that difficulty. And I think certainly, having something to transition to is a lot easier. So I feel very lucky for that versus sort of having to think about what to do when it's finished. So I think having that already kind of set up for me was helpful. In
What
terms of,
enabled you
yeah,
to break out? So this 12-month period, Cancha in the
yeah.
background, was there a trigger event that enabled you to make that leap of faith into the entrepreneurial space? Was it some advice that you received? Was it an event that took place? Was there something that triggered you over there?
I think it was a mix of the fact that it was quite a dynamic time for starting the business in terms of everything was so new to me. So, designing bags, visiting, factories for the first time, having, finance, figuring out the finance side of things, all those things were all very new to me. And so it kind of kept me spinning and moving forward. It kind of was the kind of head down and having to work on these things, either that or it wasn't going to happen sort of thing. And I think that helped me. I think that certainly, it was a pandemic during that time. So I think I was lucky in the sense that situationally, I think a lot of people were kind of in this period where they weren't sure what they were doing. And so I almost had an opportunity to kind of get stuck into something without it necessarily without having a massive negative impact on my life, because either that or I wasn't going to be doing a whole lot else. I suppose I try not to put too much, that I did something particularly amazing to get myself out of that. I think I was very lucky with the circumstances I had. And the people around me. And I think that made a big difference. And I think it is really important having the right people around you when you're doing something like that as well, because I think there are a lot of difficult moments, and I think being able to kind of share those with somebody and being able to get their kind of support is really, really helpful to moving forward.
Now, what I was wondering, I'm looking at your life. I'm looking at, what you've achieved. And how often do you actually compare your life to the life of some of your friends your age that decided to work for corporates or consultancy, considering that work-life balance is a reality for them? It probably is not for you. Have you ever considered to say, well, it's not worth it? Or so what is your thinking around that?
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, it does happen. I think it's very hard for it not to, because of the fact, I think that's one of the reasons why I think having a co-founder is important. And it's not something I do have, but I think if I was starting a second business at some point in the future, I would look into that, because I think it helps dealing with those, having somebody who you're able to compare to, but actually is in the same situation as you, who's in that, but who can understand your kind of the situation. I think is really helpful. But in general, it does happen, I think. And yeah, I don't have much of a work-life balance, and it is pretty much 7 days a week without, it's very hard to be able to kind of disconnect, because you almost really, really can't. And so that is really hard. And I think there's always the difficult thing. What I compare to is my tennis career. And I think in terms of fear, I worry that my career as an entrepreneur could end up just like it did in tennis, in the sense that if you look at it from, say, a negative perspective, when I am in that kind of frame of mind, is that will I just not really achieve what I was really aiming for, just like I did with tennis, sort of thing. And when I think about that, I have other thoughts as well, which primarily, well, if I think about everything I learned through tennis, the countries I was able to visit, the languages I picked up, all these different things that were hugely beneficial for the next thing. And I think that how much I've learned from Cancha in various domains, I mean, I just can't imagine how I would have picked up that knowledge that I have now, and the position I am in now, in terms of what I feel on my ability to do is. When I think about that, and I also think about how much I love the process of it, and if I had to be doing something on someone else's terms, I just don't think I'd be as happy. And so, on balance, I always swing back to knowing that this is what I want to do. But there are certainly doubts, and especially when I see what other people are doing, and sometimes, how well people are doing in corporate careers. I think it's not. I'm not understating that as a valid avenue, because I think it certainly is. I think it's just important to know yourself and know what it is you want to do.
But it does beg the question: how do you frame success? I mean, you just said you won't. You're worried that you won't get where you want to with Cancha. So that suggests that you have a clear idea of what that is. Would you share that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely see, but in terms of my vision for Cancha, I see it as becoming a global brand, in the sense that that it establishes itself within, kind of, at least within the industries that we're in terms of the tennis industry, in terms of the sort of general kind of sport industry. I think that I would love to see us become a staple within that industry, and be able to continue to bring people on in the team who and grow in that sense, and give people opportunity to kind of build with that. So I certainly see, and also just from a financial perspective, I certainly, like, my goal is certainly for it to have a positive financial outcome, both for myself, but also everyone else who's invested and supported throughout. So that's certainly part of my vision for Cancha. But like you said, there's how do you frame success, and that's one part of it, and the other part of it is the customers the interactions we've had with customers, what I've learned, the other people that we've impacted in terms of team members, and opportunities they've been given, and all those sorts of things. So I think that it is, especially with imposter syndrome, and dealing with those sort of things where you're kind of worried whether you belong or whether you're doing the right thing. It is so important. Framing is so important, because there is that kind of long-term goal, and there is the reflection side of things of, well, let me just remember where I was 5 years ago in terms of where I am now, and that's really important.
Okay. I find it actually very impressive the way you talk about process, because in my own experience, and in, I guess, David's and our experience in corporate life, it's so important not to think about the next promotion or the next. It's so important to really enjoy the process. Success is ultimately an outcome. And I really like the way you framed it in your tennis career, how much you learned. And so that's great. Ask you one more question, which I think, and this is really important, because I really think you're an example in terms of your values, but How important is integrity when you're a startup entrepreneur? And how do you see what's currently unfolding in business and the world? Can you be successful and maintain a high degree of integrity? Is that possible?
Yeah, I really like this question. I think none of us are perfect, but I do not want to be in business without feeling like without having that integrity, without feeling like I'm having a positive impact on the world. I mean, not to say, that that we're having this amazingly positive impact on the world, but in terms of the people that we interact with, in terms of, I want to care about the small things in terms of whether it's our suppliers, and I want to be on friendly terms with them. I want them to enjoy working with us, with my team. I want to enjoy working with them, with the customers. And so I think, and being truthful about everything is really important as well. I think for me, it's extremely important. I think it's important to be, you can't control whether people like you or not, but I think it's important that you can be likable. And I think that I don't prescribe to the Trump style of business in terms of kind of this, hard negotiating power sort of thing. I think I understand the values of that, but I just don't think it's the only way. I think really caring about other people is a really important mechanism for creating something that you actually enjoy, and then also actually it also pays dividends to you as well, inadvertently, because people want to help you and people want to support something that they feel like is supporting them. And so I do believe, in terms of my own values, that's possible. Some people would say that it isn't. I think we're in a time at the moment in business and in the world where it seems less possible, and what we're seeing in terms of some leaders in the world, whether it's in business or not. But I think there are certainly people that rise above that. We see that occasionally, and I think we all want to be on board with that.
The power of leverage and whether you should use it, I think is well said. Can I ask a question? I'm intrigued by this question because in a way, Helmut and I battle it in the publishing space. Would you rather, so this is a either or question, would you rather create a product that you passionately believe in, that you think serves some purpose that you yourself would use, that is unique in some way, and take pride in that invention, even if it only sells one? Or would you rather produce something that sells, let's say 1,000, but it's generic? It's the same as it's the Adidas bag with a different logo on it. Which would you rather?
Yeah, I've got a very strong opinion on this one. I would rather create something that feels unique to me. So, for example, if my product is a 4 out of 10 or 5 out of 10 to begin with, but it's novel, it's unique, it's doing something different, or I could have copied what's out there, and what's out there is a 7 out of 10. I don't mind being the 5 out of 10 because I can push to get to that 7, 8 out of 10. But if I just copy the 7 out of 10 that's already out there, I haven't really got any room to move, and also I don't own that. I don't have any control over that. And I think I did this with Cancha. I think I started with a 5 or 6 out of 10 product, and I think we've grown that over time because I had a unique approach to what I wanted the product to be. And so I try and apply that going forward as well. Is that I think a big example is Dyson. They often come out with products that are extremely unique, but actually inferior to begin with than what's exactly out there. But they very quickly rise above that. And they aren't afraid to take risks. Remember these the headphones with air masks they came out with during COVID? That was just a complete disaster. But they have to do that because they have to create products that align with their identity and that they feel that they believe have a place to exist in the world. Whether the market agrees with that is a different thing, but they exist for that reason. And so I really like their approach to product because I think I would much rather that approach than other options out there, I think.
It's actually very consistent with Steve Jobs, who once famously said, I don't care what the customer thinks. The customer doesn't know what he
No,
wants or
yeah.
she wants. We will tell them what they need. And in many ways, this is true. But this was actually a feedback. Thanks, by the way, David, for giving me the feedback. Feedback is always a gift because we always argue about, like, shall we stay very, very unique in what we're doing? Or shall we actually, to a certain extent, go a bit more mainstream? Because we're obviously not very mainstream. And I think ultimately it's a bit of both. But Basically, I think you're leaning more towards David's side. And look how he's smirking now. He is absolutely delighted about this answer. 10 out of 10.
Jack, we're going to segue into closing the podcast now. I think Helmut said this on the last podcast we did. The time on these podcasts just flies by. It's like a time machine. We could talk much longer, and it feels like we've only scratched the surface of some of these. Helmut likes to close this section by asking one final question of our guests. Helmut, would you like to do so?
I mean, Jack, what is the one big advice you would give to like a young person, a young tech, like 20, 21, 22, who sets out to basically live the dreams in starting their own company? What is the one thing you would give them on the journey?
Yeah, I think you have to trust your instincts. I think in terms of it's very easy to think that other people have the answers, and often a lot of the time they don't. And although advice and feedback is hugely important, I think I've often swayed in the past, back and forth between what people have told me, and ended up lining more closely to what I originally was doing in terms of. And so I think in terms of that, I think taking on advice is really important, but I think not forgetting your own belief and value system behind things and sticking with, or just holding that accountable to every other decision that comes along, because I think that you can fall into the trap of thinking that people know a lot, or know the answers to your problems, when really they may only know the answers to theirs. And so I think that would be my advice.
Great very advice. Good. I think very true.
Well, Jack, thank you for joining us on this podcast. It's been extraordinary. If I was to attempt a summary, I would say great example of reinvention, professional reinvention. Our latest book talks about how difficult it is for human beings to change direction, how we get caught in routines, and how we create sort of ecosystems that support our existing routines. And breaking out of that is extraordinarily difficult. And you're a great story, a great success story. And thank you very much for supporting our efforts to write some stuff in the career space over the years. Let me end the podcast a little bit by sharing a few things, a few links. Cancha, I'll provide the link to the Cancha website in the podcast here if you'd like to go and check some of Jack's very innovative products, including Helmut's wallet. Magnetic, isn't it? Magnetic. There's a sort of magnetic clasp on it.
It's the best very impressive product, the best wallet ever.
Yeah. So we'll provide a link for that. This podcast is one of a series of Dr. Schuster and Oxley podcasts. We've been doing it for about a year now. This is episode number 21. This will be going out in late February. So for those of you who haven't checked out our previous podcasts, let me provide you with a link to all of those. Helmut's very keen for me to say the following, that if you enjoyed this podcast or any of the podcasts, you will love the books. So there are currently 3 books out there. Jack was in A Career Carol. If you want to check that one out and see his very, very memorable quotes, you can get that book. And the other 2 books that were out last year are Groundhog Career and Artificial Death of a Career. We also have a fantastic newsletter that we send out free to our subscribers every month. If you'd like to check that out, here is a link. And then finally, if you're not following us on LinkedIn and Instagram, you really should, because there is some incredible content, and most of it is written with a little bit of humor that Helmut sometimes doesn't like, but is, I still think, very valuable. With that, any final words, Jack? Anything finally from you?
No, just thank you so much for having me, and highly recommend the books. I've read all 3, and they've been hugely beneficial to me in my own journey. And so, yeah, I definitely recommend, if you're listening to this, that you check them out for sure.
Do you have a favorite?
Well, I don't want to say the first one, because I feel like that's just saying because I was in it. No, I think honestly, I think it's I really think it's important you read all 3, because I love Shay's journey throughout them, and I think it's kind of really closes off nicely in the 3rd. And I think just following through that journey throughout all 3 books is really great.
Thank you very much. You were great. I think your advice so great. But the other thing is you referenced like book 1. I was recently reading what you said in book 1. It's actually really great. You were very wise so many years ago. So well done to that. Yeah. And then I want to say auf Wiedersehen and goodbye to everyone. See you next time. David, over to you.
Goodbye, everyone. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.